From the opening hours of the 1999 war in Kosovo, an overriding tactic was evident in Serb military strategy: the gender-selective detention and mass killing of ethnic Albanian men, especially those of battle age. Adam Jones and colleagues put together the scholarly work on genocide, which isn't a lot by the way, and he put it in this book. Gendercide and Genocide is a compelling and scholarly examination of the intersection between gender and mass violence. This is viewed with a multidisciplinary approach, and we have numerous contributors to this book, ranging from all kinds of disciplines. Stick around to hear my rating of the book at the end of the video. Before we get into it, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Part 1. Why does this sound new? One of the goals of this book is to define what gendercide means, and explore why it has been missing from the literature. But when it is time to recognize the gender aspects of conflict, this question is crucial because acknowledging the gendered dimensions of violence can shape both our theoretical frameworks and practical responses to conflict. Quote, a subjectivist answer is that a conflict is gender related whenever the participants declare gender to be important. It starts with intentions. An objectivist answer instead starts with consequences. An objectivist approach relies on empirical evidence and statistical data to reveal gendered patterns of harm and survival. Quote, indeed, the worst gender-selective slaughter in human history, perhaps the most concentrated mass killing of any kind, target male prisoners of war barely half a century ago. I refer to the mass liquidation by Nazi forces of Soviet POWs, 2.8 million young, healthy Soviet POWs. Here lies a problem with the objectivist approach. Because of its broader analytical lens, it enables us to identify and address gendered impacts that may not be immediately apparent or explicitly acknowledged by participants. The killing of that many men is horrific, yet other factors may carry more weighting than the gender of the soldiers. This is a big issue that this book attempts to tackle, and to be honest, it does a great job. I have a great appreciation for this book due to its structure. Not only do we attempt to look at how gender plays a role in genocides, but we explore just how significant they are. Quote, I draw a distinction between gender and gendercide. Gendercide is potentially a subclass of mass killings that needs to be defined by the specification of necessary and sufficient conditions of membership in it. Gender is one of a range of variables that may be etiological consequence in a proportion of mass killings. We see in later chapters the pushback around the definition of gendercide. Authors in the later chapters try to be pragmatic about gendercide as a discipline. A big thing to think about is the fact that gendercide needs very specific definitions within the broader definition of genocide itself. A conflation of sex and gender was also brought up, and it raises interesting questions. The biggest one I have is how we as a society will weigh the different motivations behind the genocide, because each one is different. However, I don't think the critiques of genocide hold much weight against some of the basic points that Jones brings up. We went a very long time without acknowledging that boys and men are victims of genocide. The feminist movement that occurred in the 20th century was happening at the same time as a lot of these monstrous genocides. Therefore, it was set up perfectly by feminists to portray how women are the victims in war. However, what seems to have happened is that human rights meant women's rights. This created an imbalance in reporting and researching. Due to this, we now get phrases like women are most affected by war, etc, etc, and these pop up time and time again. All the contributors in this book agreed that it is a travesty that men's experience in genocide hasn't been given the same amount of weighting as women's experience in genocide. Part 2. Male victims. When reading about gendercide, what is crazy is how Jones lists out the consistent militaristic notion that underlines a universal truth. If you somehow get men out of the way, one can do almost anything to anybody. Additionally, the results always tend to be horrific. Jones of course talks about the mass murders of women, but it is worth noting that domination is easier with men out of the way. Quote, by removing all able-bodied Armenian males from their cities, villages, hamlets, and by isolating them in the conditions of near-fatal helplessness, thus an easy prey for destruction. This observation is not only chilling but also consistent across various historical contexts. The systematic targeting of men, particularly able-bodied men, facilitates broader campaigns of terror and subjugation. Jones meticulously documents how the removal of men often precedes the most horrific acts of violence against the remaining population. This pattern is evident in numerous genocides, where the initial phase involves the systematic killing of men, thereby dismantling the primary line of defense against further atrocities. Male slaves were often seen as potential leaders and source of rebellion. By targeting them, even slave owners aimed to undermine a possibility of organized resistance. This strategy was not just about physical suppression but also psychological domination, aiming to instill fear and helplessness. Quote, "The black male became the focal point of this ambitious project. The public spectacle of the ritual flogging, burning, and castration and execution of male slaves became an important and enduring method of discouraging leadership and group cohesion within the slave population." Chapter 6 deals with the issues of black male genocide in America. I really appreciated this chapter because it's the only one I believe that touches on psychological genocide, and that leads in some interesting topics. Slavery was designed to break the spirit of enslaved individuals, erasing their identities, cultures, and histories. Enslaved people were systematically denied education, family bonds, cultural practices were suppressed. This sustained psychological torture was a deliberate strategy to dehumanize and control the enslaved population. For me, this strategy seems to toe the line between subjectivity and objectivity of genocide in a strange way. Slave masters and even the general population weren't above killing slaves, yet they didn't want to kill too many in one go because they needed their labor. However, the art of sexually subjugating black women allowed for a form of continual systematic genocide. This is where my mind went after reading the chapter, and it is food for thought. There's another reason why I highly recommend this book. To conclude this chapter, this quote in the book adds another layer to how we haven't given men their due as victims. Quote, "If we combine the evidence from the new studies of men, feminist research, and the research on genocidal and holocaust producing conflicts, it becomes clear that the marginalization and devaluation of men's caring potential, including the attempt to erase men's caring and emotional sensibilities in wars, have been much more costly to society than is ordinarily presumed." This insight challenges the traditional narratives that primarily associate men with roles of aggression and combat in wartime, ignoring their vulnerabilities and emotional capabilities, especially when it comes to looking after their families. Part 3. It gets darker. Jones's exploration of genocide reveals a grim reality. The targeting of men in genocidal campaigns is a calculated tactic to weaken and dismantle entire communities. Take the Rwanda genocide against the Tutsi in the 90s. Which is talked about quite a lot in this book. The African Rights Report, named Death, Despair and Defiance, noted that, quote, "The primary target of the hunt were Tutsi men, particularly what extremist propaganda portrayed as the ultimate enemy. Rich men, men between their 20s and 40s, especially if they were well-educated professionals or students. This understanding challenges traditional narratives of genocide that may overlook the gender-specific dimensions of such violence. Jones does a good job of illustrating how tribal warfare, alongside economic constraints, adds to the intensity of a genocide. This genocide, like all, is very horrifying, and his book showcases even more horrors. What struck me was just how far the violence went in Rwanda. It got to the point where even newborn babies were being killed, because the perpetrators were planning a generation ahead. My jaw dropped when it was mentioned that nuns were even in on the genocidal act against men. Chapter 7 is entitled Genetic Engineering and Queer Biotechnology, and it was written by Stephanie Rizeka. I like that this chapter attempts to preempt a potential genocide for a group of people. Rizeka showcases how the Human Genome Project could be used to eradicate homosexual people. This chapter made me appreciate this book on a whole other level. Not only had this book looked at a psychological genocide of African American men, but it was now attempting to theorize potential threats for future genocide of a minority group, which I think is really important because I, like most of you, don't think much about these things like the Human Genome Project. And I won't lie, these are usually the things that allow atrocities to occur, because it's only when the madness has actually started to happen that we actually start to understand. What I love that this book portrayed is that each gender not only has its own issues in general, but its own issues during genocide. Combatants seem to have a wider range of uses for women. As seen in the book, there are times where women were free to roam about normally, even during conflict. However, the other end of the spectrum is the rape and the death of women, sometimes even involving crazy mutilation. That'll probably have some people rethinking even consensual S&M sex. The nuances of being a woman in this type of environment is crazy, because even with genocides that have an ethnic cleansing goal, women seem to be detached from their ethnicity by their perpetrators, but they're seen perfectly as women. Therefore, their uses in the eyes of combatants are the same as any other woman, regardless of the hate that they may have for them if their other characteristics warrant it. Then on the other hand, you have men. It has been documented that even newborn baby boys are not exempt from being killed during a genocide. When it comes to purposeful acts like this, I understand why the study of gendercide is needed. The age range of men and boys on the hit list holds no bounds in many cases of gendercide and genocide. It's basically on site for everyone with an XY chromosome. This seems to be because combatants know that little boys will form the next generation of rebels. That is if an oppressor's rule over another people even holds longer than a generation. Regardless, some of the sickest and twisted minds are planning ahead. It's like they're preparing for the next election cycle or something. Just reading about all these things was a mindfuck. Denouement. This is a fantastic book, which will make you think long and hard about how gender and sex play a role in mass killings and genocide. This book is a call to actually look at gender from both sides, but it doesn't recommend that gender take top priority. This quote sums it up. Neither women nor men constitute a group that, as a whole, has been targeted for extermination by another group, members of their opposite sex, nor have sex-selective or sex-related atrocities generally been directed against men or women as such. There are so many nuances to violence on the level of mass killings and genocide, but it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a focus on gender and sex, particularly when it comes to male victims. Let's move on to the rating for this book. Scores are out of 100. So for Gendercide and Genocide, they are as follows. Usefulness 78, engagement 85, depth 70, accuracy 85, clarity 85, uniqueness 95, book cover 65, overall score 80.25. What I really appreciate about this book is that it attempts to fill a significant gap in genocide literature. Early in the book, Jones even ponders how men could lose their lives in the millions, yet it still wasn't being studied, and how it doesn't produce an emotional reaction compared to women and children. This book has detailed analysis and comprehensive approach to genocide and genocide. I think that is an essential read for anyone interested in understanding the complex dynamics of gender and mass violence. The work of Jones and all the other researchers challenge readers to rethink conventional understandings of genocide. It highlights the critical importance of incorporating gender perspectives into analysis of mass atrocities, particularly those faced by men, as they are marked for war, conflict and enslavement in numerous ways. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.